She was 34 years old. She drove a brown 1978 Buick with a cracked rear bumper and a St. Christopher medal hanging from the rearview mirror that her mother had given her the day she got her license. On the evening of June 7, 1983, she told her husband she was going to the grocery store, backed out of the driveway of their house on Mill Pond Road in Grover's Crossing, Tennessee, and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who left her family. That is a story about what a lake can hide for 22 years, and what happens when the water finally runs out. It would take 2 decades, a historic drought, and a county dredging crew that was not looking for anything in particular to give Marion Pruitt's family the answer they had waited 22 years to hear. And it would take 1 more year after that, and a piece of evidence so small that investigators very nearly missed it, to name the man responsible. But before any of that, you have to understand Grover's Crossing in 1983, because the community that Marion came from shaped everything that happened to her, and everything that was done and not done in the years that followed. Grover's Crossing sat in the rolling hill country of western Tennessee, the kind of town that appeared on the state map as a small dot and looked exactly like what it was, a community of about 1,800 people who had organized their lives around the same church, the same school district, the same county fair in September, and the same deep, mutual understanding that when something happened to one family, it happened to all of them. The lake was called Tanner Reservoir. It had been built in 1941 by the county to provide irrigation water for the farmland to the north, and in the 4 decades since, it had become something else entirely, a place where people fished on Saturday mornings and teenagers went after Friday football games and children learned to swim in the shallower end near the boat landing. It was not a large lake, half a mile across at its widest, ringed on 3 sides by cedar and hickory, with a gravel access road running along the western bank where county maintenance trucks could reach the water control gate. In summer, the surface of Tanner Reservoir caught the late light and turned the color of copper, and people drove out after dinner, sometimes just to sit and watch it. Marion Pruitt had grown up 2 miles from that lake. She had learned to swim in it when she was 8 years old. She and her husband Roy had gotten engaged on the eastern bank in 1972, with the water behind them and Roy down on one knee in his good shoes, sinking slowly into the soft mud, which Marion had laughed about for years afterward. By 1983, Marion and Roy had been married 11 years. They had a daughter, Beth Ann, who was 9, and a son, Cody, who was 6, and had recently lost his 2 front teeth and wore the gap-toothed smile with tremendous pride. Marion worked 4 mornings a week at the county assessor's office, where she had worked since Beth Ann started school. She had a desk by the window that looked out onto the courthouse square, and she knew every property owner in Grover's Crossing by name and probably by mortgage. She brought homemade biscuits to the office on Fridays. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of people's children and sent birthday cards to elderly neighbors and kept a spare umbrella in her car in case someone else needed it. She wore her dark blonde hair to her shoulders and had a habit of tucking it behind one ear when she was concentrating on something. She laughed easily and argued fairly and had strong opinions about pie crust, which she made from scratch because she believed the store-bought kind was an insult to the concept of pie. On the evening of June 7, 1983, she put Beth Ann and Cody to bed, kissed Roy on the cheek, picked up her purse and her keys, and told him she was going to run to Donahue's grocery for milk and coffee before it closed at 9. Roy was watching the news. He told her to drive safe. The St. Christopher medal turned once on the mirror as she backed down the drive. She never came home. Roy waited until 9:30, then called Donahue's. The night manager told him Marion had not been in that evening. Roy drove to Donahue's himself, then drove the 2 routes between the house and the store, then drove them again. He got home at 11:15 and called the Grover's Crossing Police Department. The officer who took the call suggested Roy wait until morning. She might have stopped at a friend's. She might have needed some time. Roy Pruitt, told the officer, with a steadiness that the report would later describe as calm, but that everyone who knew Roy understood was the voice of a man holding himself together for the children asleep in the next room, that his wife did not need time, and that something was wrong. By morning, the department had opened a formal missing persons case. The lead detective assigned was a man named Arvis Holcomb, a 26-year veteran of the Grover's Crossing PD who had the broad, unhurried confidence of a man who had seen most things and understood that what he hadn't seen yet was probably coming. He interviewed Roy for 2 hours. He interviewed Marion's sister June and her closest friend, a woman named Patsy Dodd who worked at the school cafeteria. He put Marion's photograph on the telephone pole outside the courthouse and at the gas station on Route 12, and at the counter of Donahue's grocery, where the night manager looked at it and said he was sorry and that he would watch for her. Nobody found the Buick that day or the day after. It appeared on the third day. A farm equipment dealer named Thurston Veal was driving the county road along the western bank of Tanner Reservoir at 7:30 in the morning when he saw the rear end of a brown car submerged in the shallow water near the access point, partially screened by the cedar overhang, only the bumper and the top 3 inches of the trunk lid visible above the waterline. He stopped his truck and walked to the bank and stood there looking at it for a moment. Then he drove to the county road and flagged down the first car that passed. The Buick was recovered that afternoon. Marion was not inside it. The car had entered the water at an angle from the access road, consistent with having rolled or been pushed. The gear selector was in neutral, the driver's door was closed, the St. Christopher medal was gone from the mirror. Arvis Holcomb stood on the bank and looked at the water for a long time. He ordered a dive team from the county sheriff's department. They searched Tanner Reservoir for 4 days. They did not find Marion. The official conclusion, written carefully and without certainty into the case file, was that Marion Pruitt had either entered the water voluntarily or that her body had been submerged elsewhere and was not in the reservoir. The dive team had covered the accessible portions of the lake's floor, but acknowledged that the silt levels in the deeper central section made a complete search impossible with the equipment available in 1983. The case remained open. The water kept its secret. Roy Pruitt's sister came to stay for the first 2 weeks. Then his mother came for the third. By July, Roy was alone in the house on Mill Pond Road with 2 children who asked him questions he could not answer, and he told them their mother had gone somewhere and they were looking for her, and he told them this so many times over so many months that Beth Ann eventually stopped asking and Cody eventually forgot what he was asking about, and that particular silence settled over the house on Mill Pond Road and became the shape of their lives. Arvis Holcomb pursued the case through the end of 1983 and most of 1984. He built a profile of Marion's movements in the week before she disappeared. He looked at the people in her life. He looked at the assessor's office, at her colleagues, at anyone who had recently had a dispute over a property matter. He looked at Roy, carefully and without accusation, the way a good detective has to, and he found nothing that pointed in that direction. Roy Pruitt had been home with 2 sleeping children on the night of June 7, 1983. 3 neighbors confirmed his truck had not moved that evening. The one name that came back more than once, in the peripheral way that names do when no one is sure what to do with them, was a man named Wallace Coe. Wallace was 43 years old in 1983 and worked as a county maintenance supervisor, which meant, among other things, that he was responsible for the maintenance schedule for Tanner Reservoir's water control systems and had unrestricted access to the access road along the western bank at all hours. A woman at the assessor's office told Arvis Holcomb, tentatively and with clear discomfort, that Wallace Coe had come into the office twice in the spring of 1983 on property matters and had asked Marion to explain things she had already explained in the paperwork. The woman said Marion had mentioned it to her once, in passing, and had said it made her feel strange, but she couldn't say why exactly. Arvis Holcomb interviewed Wallace Coe in August of 1983. Coe was cooperative, soft-spoken, and expressed appropriate concern. He had an alibi for the evening of June 7th. He had been at a county board meeting that ran until 8:30, and 4 other board members confirmed it. The meeting records confirmed it. Holcomb wrote his name in the file and noted the alibi, and noted the colleague's comment, and set it aside because there was nothing to attach it to. There was no body. Without a body, there was no crime scene. Without a crime scene, there was no evidence. That was what the case kept coming back to. Every road, every lead, every name. The water had taken everything. By 1986, Roy Pruitt had sold the house on Mill Pond Road. He could not keep living on a road that faced the direction she had driven away from. He moved to a rental on the other side of town, closer to his mother. Beth Ann was 12 by then, old enough to understand something that she was not old enough to know how to carry. Cody was 9. He had started drawing pictures of fish in school, which his teacher had mentioned to Roy once and then not mentioned again. By 1991, 8 years had passed since Marion drove out of the driveway on Mill Pond Road. Arvis Holcomb had retired from the department the previous spring, with a handshake and a cake in the break room, and a box of files he kept in his study at home, among which was a manila folder labeled Pruitt, M. 1983. He looked at it sometimes when he couldn't sleep. By 1997, 14 years out, Roy Pruitt had remarried. A quiet woman named Ellen, who understood without being told that there was a part of Roy's life she would never fully enter, and who had the grace to honor that without resentment. Beth Ann was in college in Nashville. Cody was working at a printing company in Memphis. Roy drove back to Grover's Crossing on the anniversary of June 7th every year and sat for a while on the eastern bank of Tanner Reservoir, which was the closest thing he had to a place to be. He brought flowers sometimes, though there was nowhere to put them. He set them at the water's edge and watched the current take them. By 2002, 19 years gone, the case was functionally dormant. The detective, who had inherited it from Holcomb, had retired. The department had staffing changes and a new chief and a backlog of active cases, and cold cases required a particular kind of patience that active ones did not always allow for. Tanner Reservoir sat where it had always sat, ringed by cedar and hickory, turning copper in the late light. Before we continue, every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts and piecing together real lives that deserved better than what they got. If you want us to keep uncovering stories like Marion's, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Tanner Reservoir. The summer of 2005 was the driest summer in western Tennessee in recorded history. By July, the rainfall deficit for the year had reached 26 inches below average. The Cumberland River was at historic lows. Stock ponds across the region were cracking at their edges, and Tanner Reservoir, which had not dropped below 60% capacity since 1953, was receding at a rate that the County Water Authority had not seen in its institutional memory. By August 14, 2005, the water level had dropped 11 feet from its normal mark. The cedar and hickory on the banks stood above a wide apron of exposed gray mud that smelled of fish and deep earth, and things that had been submerged for a long time. The county sent a maintenance crew out on August 14th to assess the water control infrastructure and document the low water conditions. One of the crew members, a 27-year-old utility worker named Ben Olcott, walked the exposed mudflat along the northern bank to check the intake screen near the deeper section of the reservoir. He was stepping carefully in rubber boots across the gray mud when he nearly walked into something that was not mud. He stopped. He looked at it. He looked around at the empty bank and the receding water and the gray sky. He took out the radio on his belt and called his supervisor. The Grover's Crossing Police Department arrived at Tanner Reservoir at 11:40 that morning. State forensic investigators arrived by early afternoon. What they found in the exposed sediment of the northern basin was a set of remains, skeletal, largely intact, alongside the corroded remains of a woman's shoe and a small metal clasp consistent with a purse fastener. With the remains was a St. Christopher medal, its chain green with oxidation, but the medal itself still clearly legible. Marion Pruitt had been in Tanner Reservoir the entire time. She had been in the one section of the lake the 1983 dive team had not been able to reach, the deepest part of the northern basin, where the silt depth had made visibility impossible with 1983 equipment. She had been there for 22 years, waiting for the water to give up what it was holding. Roy Pruitt received the call at his home at 3:30 in the afternoon. Ellen sat beside him on the kitchen step while he held the phone and did not speak for a long time. His daughter Beth Ann was called next, then Cody. That evening, the three of them drove to Tanner Reservoir and stood on the bank and looked at the place where the water had receded and said nothing for a long time, because there was nothing yet that language could reach. The discovery of Marion's remains reopened the case with the full weight of a homicide investigation. A forensic anthropologist from Vanderbilt University confirmed that the manner of death was consistent with blunt force trauma, evidence readable in the skeletal remains despite 22 years of submersion. Marion Pruitt had not entered Tanner Reservoir voluntarily. She had been placed there. The St. Christopher medal became the pivot point of the new investigation. It had been removed from the Buick's rearview mirror before the car was pushed into the water. The mirror bracket showed no medal when the car was recovered in 1983, yet it was found with Marion's remains in the northern basin. That sequence told a story. Someone had taken it from the car. Someone had kept it or placed it deliberately. The new lead detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Patricia Sen of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit, who had joined the unit 3 years earlier after 12 years with the Nashville Metro Police. She was precise and methodical and had a habit, colleagues said, of rereading the original case files 3 times before touching anything new, because the answer, in her experience, was almost always there from the beginning. She read the Pruitt file 3 times. On the 3rd reading, she stopped at Arvis Holcomb's note about Wallace Coe. She read the colleague's account of the assessor's office visits. She noted that Coe had county access to the Reservoir Road at all hours. She noted that his alibi placed him at the board meeting until 8:30, and that the grocery store closed at 9, meaning Marion had left the house and arrived at the reservoir and been killed in a window of less than 30 minutes, consistent with a meeting time that ended at 8:30. She pulled Wallace Coe's current address from the state records database. He was 65 years old. He had retired from the county in 1998 and was living outside of Cookeville, 2 counties away. She submitted the St. Christopher medal to the TBI Forensic Lab for trace evidence analysis. 22 years of submersion had degraded most surface material, but the clasp mechanism on the medal's chain, a small folded metal fitting, had corroded in a way that preserved biological material within the fold. The lab identified a partial DNA profile from cellular material trapped in the mechanism. The process of forensic genetic genealogy, uploading partial profiles to ancestry databases and working backward through family trees, was explained to the public in a press statement the following spring as the methodology that had cracked a case other methods could not crack. The process works by matching trace DNA to distant relatives in public genealogy databases, then tracing those relatives forward through family records until the source of the DNA can be identified. For older audiences, unfamiliar with the technology, it functions something like finding a needle by tracing every thread in the haystack back to the same spool. The profile traced to a family in the Cookeville area. Wallace Coe's name appeared in the family tree. Patricia Sen drove to Cookeville on a Tuesday morning in March of 2007. She arrived at Wallace Coe's house at 8:15 a.m. He answered the door in work clothes, as if he had been awake for a while. He was a large man who had grown heavier in retirement, with the look of someone who had spent 22 years being careful and was very, very tired of it. She showed him her badge. She said his name. He stepped back from the door and sat down in the chair nearest the entry without being asked, as if his legs had made a decision his mind hadn't quite finished making. "It was the lake," he said. He said it quietly, the way you state something that has been true for so long it no longer feels like a confession. "I always thought the lake would keep it." He was arrested on a charge of first-degree murder. The community of Grover's Crossing learned his name on the evening news the following day. People who had voted for Wallace Coe's budget proposals at county meetings, who had waved to him at the hardware store, who had passed him in the corridor of the county office building for 15 years without a second thought, sat with that information and tried to make it fit into the shape of a man they recognized. It did not fit. It never does, with the ones who do it well enough to go 22 years undetected. The mask holds until there is nothing left to hold it. Wallace Coe was convicted of first-degree murder in September of 2008, following a 2-week trial. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He did not testify. He sat through the verdict with the same stillness he had shown at his front door, the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for a thing to finally arrive and has no energy left to pretend otherwise. Roy Pruitt was in the courtroom. He was 62 years old. He sat in the second row with Beth Ann on his left and Cody on his right, and when the verdict was read, he put his hand flat on the rail in front of him and pressed down hard, as if he needed something solid to push against. Marion Pruitt was 34 years old. She drove a brown Buick with a cracked rear bumper and kept a St. Christopher medal on her rearview mirror, and made pie crust from scratch, and remembered everyone's children by name, and sent birthday cards to elderly neighbors, and had a husband who got down on one knee in the soft mud at the edge of a lake and meant every word of it. She was buried on a Saturday in October of 2005 in the Grover's Crossing Methodist churchyard, where her parents were already at rest. Roy planted a redbud at the base of her stone the following spring, because she had always said that redbuds were the bravest trees, blooming before anything else, before there was any real warmth to justify it, trusting that the warmth would come. Beth Ann gave a statement to the Grover's Crossing paper after the conviction. She said her mother had been the kind of person who made everyone around her feel steadier, and that the 22 years without her had been 22 years of learning to be steady without the person who had taught them how. She said she hoped the jury understood that a life sentence was not justice exactly, because nothing was justice, but it was the closest word the law had. Cody, who had stopped drawing fish sometime in his 20s, but had never entirely understood why he had drawn them as a child, said only that he was glad she was home. Tanner Reservoir was refilled the following autumn when the rains returned, as they always do. The water rose back to its normal mark and turned copper again in the late light, and the people of Grover's Crossing drove out after dinner sometimes to sit and watch it. It looked exactly as it always had. That is the particular nature of what water hides. It does not change what it holds. It does not wear it down or diminish it. It simply keeps it beneath the surface, beneath the ordinary and the beautiful, and the seasons turning over it year after year, waiting with a patience that has nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with time. The question Marion's case leaves with every investigator who reads it, and there are investigators who still read it, in cold case seminars and evidence review trainings, is whether a complete search of Tanner Reservoir's northern basin in 1983 would have found her. Whether the technology of the time, pushed harder, might have changed everything. Whether 22 years of a family's life might have looked different with an earlier answer. There is no way to know. What is known is that the water did, eventually, give her back. And that is worth something. It is not enough, but it is worth something. What strikes you most about this case was the failure to search the deeper section of the reservoir in 1983, the critical turning point, or something else. And what do you think about Wallace Coe's words at the door? "I always thought the lake would keep it." What does a sentence like that tell us about the 22 years he lived with what he had done? Justice found Marion Pruitt after 22 years, when the water finally ran out. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth finds its way regardless of how long it takes, subscribe, and the description has more cases waiting. Thank you for being here.